Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to this series on Elaine Showalter's seminal essay, Toward a Feminist Poetics. Today, we will look at Showalter's concept of gynocriticism, and we will also look at Showalter's three-phase model of women's literary history. So let's begin by analyzing Showalter's model of feminist critique and gynocritiques. Now, central to Showalter's project is the argument that feminist criticism is not singular, but it consists of two distinct and complementary modes. What are these two modes? The first is the feminist critique, that is, woman as reader, and the second is gynocritiques, that is, woman as writer. Now, Showalter makes the distinction explicit. She says that feminist criticism is concerned with woman as reader and it probes the ideological assumptions of literary phenomena. What does that mean? It means that it examines how women are represented in male authored texts, how stereotypes are produced, and how patriarchal values they circulate through literature. Now, by contrast, your gynocritiques studies woman as the producer of textual meaning with the history, themes, genres, and structures of literature by women. So, if the feminist critique asks what literature does to women, your gynocritiques asks what women do with literature. Now, Showalter names the second mode using the French term la gynocritique, explaining that English possesses no term for such a specialized discourse. So, here the naming is itself political. Here, to name is to create the space for, existence. Now, let's delve into each of the modes a bit deeply. So, first, let's talk about the feminist critique. Now, Showalter describes the feminist critique as historically grounded, oriented toward images of women, patriarchal myths, and the politics of representation. So, the feminist critique it exposes how literary traditions define womanhood through binaries. What are these binaries? There's binary of virgin and whore, there's binary of angel and monster, there's binary of mother and temptress. Now, to further illustrate such distortion, Showalter turns to Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. And she contrasts Irving Howe's reading of the wife selling scene in Hardy's novel. She says that is so insidiously attractive to male fantasy, and she contrasts this scene with how a woman reader would experience its brutality. So Showalter says that Howe fantasizes Suzanne Henchard as drooping, complaining, and passive, even though Hardy provides no such details. So here Showalter's point is quite incisive. Male critiques often read women characters not as written, but as imagined through fantasies of masculinity. And the feminist critique exposes these fantasies. Now we can, extend this critique beyond Hardy to mainstream media. For instance, in many Bollywood romances, the heroines they just exist to transform the flawed hero through love. Kabir Singh being a recent example where your female body becomes the site of male rage and redemption. Similarly, in Hollywood action films, also, love interests die to motivate male protagonists. This is a trope which is called by critics as fridging. But Showalter says that there's a problem in feminist critique because she says it is limited by its male centeredness. What does she say? She says that one of the problems of the feminist critique is that it is male oriented. So the danger is that women become objects of study but not subjects of expression. They are talked about but they are not listened to. So now, what Showalter proposes to correct this imbalance? She proposes gynocritiques. What is gynocritiques? It is a criticism which is grounded in women's literary production, creativity, and cultural experiences. Whereas the feminist critique exposes oppression, your gynocritiques explores agency. So Showalter says the program of gynocritiques is to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature. This means that we should study women's writing not as marginal or aberrant, but as a tradition with its own internal history, genres, anxieties, and innovations. Now, to make gynocritiques possible, Showalter turns to anthropology, and she argues that women form subcultures. Now, this is a concept which is familiar in sociology and ethnography. So, Showalter writes that gynocritiques is related to feminist research, which have developed hypothesis of a female subculture. Now, what are these subcultures? These subcultures consist of your mother daughter relations, women's friendships, sexuality and reproduction, domestic labor, rituals and taboos. She quotes anthropologist Michelle Rosaldo, who says that the very symbolic and social conceptions that appear to set women apart may be used by women as a basis for female solidarity and worth. So, Showalter is using all this research to argue that women's writing encodes these subcultural forms. Sometimes it does openly, sometimes it does cryptically. Now, to give you an example, you can see this in literature. You can look at the sisterhood in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. You can look at matrilineal domestic worlds in Anita Desai's novels. You can look at the collective female consciousness in works of Mahashweta Devi. Also, you can look at the maternal inheritances in Toni Morrison's famous novel, Beloved. So these all texts, they center women's sociality as the primary world rather than as secondary to men's. Now, moving on to our next heading, that is the reclamation of suffering and awakening. Now, a major theme Showalter traces is female suffering, which is as both a literary motif and a historical condition. She cites Florence Nightingale's 1852 essay Cassandra, and where your Florence Nightingale says that give us back our suffering, for out of suffering may come the cure. Now, in a lot of women's fiction, your awakening often leads not to liberation, but it leads to death. So Showalter observes that heroines like Maggie Tulliver from George Eliot's Mill on the Floors, your Lily Bart from Edith Wharton's novel The House of Mirth, your Edna Pontellier from Kate Chopin's The Awakening. So Showalter says that all these characters, they wake to worlds which offer no places for the women they wish to become. So, a lot of daily life examples also resonate here. Women today may awaken to feminist consciousness only to find their workplaces hostile, their families resistant, and relationships threatened. So, the narrative burden of reconciling selfhood with gendered expectation, it continues today as well. So Showalter notes that suicide and madness they recur as literary outcomes. She cites Muriel Sparks' The Driver's Seat, where the protagonist hunts her own murderer. Sparks' narrative suggests, as Showalter puts it, a woman creates her identity by choosing her clothes, that she creates a history by choosing her man. So, this is not some kind of pathology. It is the consequence of limited scripts of agency which are available for women. Moving on to next important concept which Showalter proposes, that is her three-phase model of women's literary history. So what are these three phases? The first phase is the feminine phase, which is from 1840 to 1880. That is the phase of imitation. What does that mean? It means that women writers at that time, they were trying to copy or imitate the style of the male writers. The second phase is the feminist phase, which is from 1880 to 1920. That is the stage of protest, where women writers were protesting against the masculinist symbols, the male authority through their writing. And the third is the female phase, that is from 1920 to the present time, where female writers were exploring their own autonomy. They were trying to develop their own writing style. So Showalter writes that the first phase, that is the feminine phase, involved efforts to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture and was marked by the adoption of the male pseudonym. So George Eliot is the famous example of this. The feminist phase, that is second phase, foregrounds collective resistance. So women in this stage, they write to expose injustice. For example, your suffrage novels, your Amazon utopias, your fiction written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And the third phase, that is the female phase, it rejects both imitation and protest. It turns instead to woman's experience as a source of form and meaning. So Showalter identifies Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson. They are the pioneers who experimented with consciousness and interiority of their female characters. So, this three stage model, this taxonomy, it remains a staple in feminist literary criticism. Why? Because it provides a historical arc rather than isolated case studies. So, that's it for today. I'll see you in the next part. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.